Oh, I'm not here. You know how it usually like makes a sound when you do stuff?
Oh, no, you're good.
Yeah. So, Colin's gonna introduce you to.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Today we have Mr. Daniel Marlin. He serves as the Director of Employee and Labor Relations for CCSU. He additionally teaches business law. Public service has and continues to be an integral part of his life. For the past 21 years, he served the state of Connecticut in a variety of positions throughout state service, including Office of the Governor, State Departments of Public Works, Administrative Services, Developmental Services, and Children and Family, as well as CCSU. Moreover, as an attorney, he provides pro bono legal services to a variety of clients in the areas of business, family, employment, and trust and estate law. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Colin. Pleasure to be here with all of you. So state employment is a vast and interesting topic, and I want to be somewhat transparent with all of you that public employment doesn't follow the same rules and regulations as private employment. And so what you learn in private employment definitely instill those skills, but with public employment, you're going to slightly think of it differently. So as public employers, you have constitutional rights that you don't have, that private employers don't have, right? So if you think about the Constitution, right, the Bill of Rights is government shall not, well, it's Congress shall not, right? But we translate it in state government as government shall not infringe upon your First Amendment rights and so forth. Unions are also dealt with differently. And so if you ever studied the labor movement, you'll know that the National Labor Relations Board covers private employers. It does not cover public employers. And so while it's very, very similar, there's some very big differences that kind of make how you navigate public employment differently. So, but some of the rules are still true today. Who you know will get you into the door faster if you don't know anyone. And so that whole networking and internships and stuff is still very, very valuable. But the one thing you want to consider, especially in state employment, is all of state employment is unionized with exception of a few public classes like managers, for example. And so in state of Connecticut public employment, you have to consider the union rules. And so you might be competing with jobs that actually already give preference to certain subsets of employees that, like for example, transfers. So if you're already employed in the class, they may have the right to that job before you. And that's even true in the public or in the private sector as well, but you really see it in the public sector, right? So the sort of old adage, the more you apply, the better, right? Because you have no idea the number of people that apply for state employment. And then when you add the labor rules to it, which aren't transparent, right, it makes it even that much more difficult. So it becomes a numbers game, right? The more you can get out there and apply, the better off you are in terms of statistics. Having said that, the average state employment, depending on the job class, can yield anywhere between 500 and 1,000 applicants. There's tons of people trying to get into the state. And so I can't emphasize enough, if state employment is a goal of yours, take the time to intern, take the time to get to know people in the agencies, because they will help pick you out of those large pools, right? If you're just a resume or a job application for them, there's 400 right behind you. And so what separates you from other people may be the slightest. And so there's no way they're interviewing 400 people, right? They're looking at maybe their top 20, and then so if they know you, you'll be in the top 20, much more. So we have two classes of service in the state. We have the classified service, and then we have the unclassified service. And what I want to show you is There. Let's see if I can So if you go to the state of Connecticut's website, the classified service, the easiest way to kind of determine whether you fall in the classified service or the unclassified service is you ask yourself, does the state agency report directly to the governor? If the state agency reports directly to the governor, then all of that employment is classified service with the exception of education. All other employment is in the unclassified service. So education, by and large, is unclassified. Why this matters is because it's going to help you determine you don't apply in all the same places, right? So classified service, if you go to the state website, will always be listed here, regardless of what state agency. So it could be CCSU, it could be the Department of Children and Families. All of the postings here represent classified service. This is where you can find the job specs that tells you about the different requirements or the different uses. There's over 2,000 jobs within the state of Connecticut's classified service. So if you wanted to be an accountant, for example, this will tell you the pay range of, it will tell you the sort of what the purpose is, and it will, whether you'll be supervising employees or who will be supervising you, give you an example of duties. These are not the actual duties, although some of them in many cases will be. And then how you're going to be assessed, right? What minimal requirements, whether there's substitutions allowed. You'll see that in many cases, be very careful when you read these. In this particular case, the substitution is a bachelor's degree. In some cases, it may say like a specific bachelor's degree. So for example, at Children and Families, you have to have an appropriate bachelor's degree. So not all bachelor's degree will qualify you for social work. Here, a master's degree in accounting is an additional towards that 6-year requirement. So if you have a master's degree in geography, you won't get that substitution, right? So the way you read this is I need to have 6 years, 2 of which must be at the paraprofessional level, right? I can substitute 4 years just having a bachelor's degree. So if I have a bachelor's in English, now I'm down to 2 years in accounting or auditing, of which those two must be at the paraprofessional level of accounting or auditing. Does that make sense to all of you and how you're reading this? One of the things that the Department of Administrative Services and the Office of OPM, or the Office of Policy and Management, they are the 2 entities that govern classified service. They're very strict. So I'll just give you just sort of a warning. They are very strict in their interpretations. And so accounting for them and auditing is accounting and auditing. It's not auditing like or accounting like, right? So often what you will find is if you have a job title that doesn't match accounting or auditing, you really have to articulate that you may be, employee A, Title I, and Title I doesn't have accountant in it or auditor in it. DAS is not going to assume that you've done accounting or auditing, right? So you really have to make sure that you articulate that you're an accountant or auditor. And let me give you a good example. So you could work in a restaurant and your title could be just waiter, but you're actually the event coordinator. And so you're doing a lot of clerical work, right? But that title waiter is not going to translate to event coordinator. And so you'll want to convey information to the person that you actually meet these requirements. Right? If you expect them to interpret, they will most likely interpret against you. Right? Why I say this is because in the classified service, you're required to take an exam, and this is your exam. And so if you fail the exam, then you're not qualified for the job, right? And so it's not enough to just take these duties. You really have to explain to them in your writing, whether it's your resume or whether it's your job application, right, how you meet whatever it is. I have the 4-year substitution, I only need the 2 years, here's how I meet the duties of auditing a department. Not all jobs are the same, so this 6 years is, the assumption is it's full-time work. So if you put down a part-time job, they're not giving you full-time credit for that. So for example, like a graduate assistant is not a full-time job. So you would not get a full year's worth. As a graduate assistant, for example, you get a half a year's worth, a full-time equivalent, right? Or whatever the number of hours. So if you only work 10 hours, then you're only getting a tenth of the full-time equivalent, right? Based on a 40-hour job. So you want to be careful and mindful of how you meet these requirements. Not that it matters to you, but if you wanted to understand this, it will tell you the union. So if you wanted to look at the union contract, right, you can go to the union contract in terms of how or what the salary ranges or the conditions of employment. While the conditions of employment are generally the same for everyone, they're slightly different. So for example, those that are in the administrative clerical, they don't have remote work in their contract. Administrative and residual do, right? They don't have flex time, and then just administrative and residual do, right? So if those things are important to you, the union contract will help give you a good idea of what it is that you want to articulate. The other thing about state employment is that we often don't call things in the same nomenclature of what you're probably used to, right? And so some of it is just figuring out what we call things. And so the easiest way, honestly, is just to scroll through these to find out what the job classes might look. And I'm going to use counseling, for example. There is a job class called community clinician. The community clinician, you would probably think, well, like, what do you think that means?
Not a counselor.
Not a counselor. So the community part, the clinician part is what kind of fools everybody. The community part is what tells you that it's not a licensed counselor. The licensed counselors are the licensed social worker or the professional counselor, the marriage and family therapist, right? The community clinician is the non-licensed clinician, right? And so you'll see here, all you need is a bachelor's degree in healthcare and 2 years working independently in clinical case management in a behavioral health setting, right? So it's a little bit bizarre in terms of navigating some of this, but this is very helpful because for if you were interested in healthcare, for example, but you hadn't received your licensure yet, this is the classification for you, right? The great thing too is it tells you here in the purpose of the class generally where the class is used. This class happens to only be used at the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. And so if you're really interested in this class to gain experience or to work while you're studying, you would want to look for jobs that are being posted at the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. They have in the state's website here, you can create a master application. You can create an application for specific jobs, right? So the master application is just a database that you just fill out, just the generic part. You're not applying for anything. It's meant to be a time saver for you so that you're not filling out an application for each and every employment, right? But be careful here, because what people end up inevitably doing is they end up genericizing so much because it's a one-size-fits-all type approach. And that's one of the worst things you could do when it comes to specific jobs. So for example, there's a clerk typist and a clerk. The difference is typing. And so if you didn't put the ability to type, you wouldn't necessarily be considered at the clerk typist level. They used to make you actually take typing exams. They don't do that anymore. But secretarial, a lot of people sort of mistake secretarial. Secretarial professions are still considered a separate and distinct profession. We've, in sort of today's time, have sort of pushed the work up so that everyone kind of does their own clerical work. That is not the state's perspective. So when we say secretarial, it's more than just typing or mutter or business, right, grammar. It's, do you have the skill sets to be what we more commonly refer to as a secretary? It's hard because they don't do competency-based recruiting. Competency-based recruiting is, if you think about it, I have the skills to do it. I don't have the experience to do it, but I have the skills to do it. I can do a calendar, right? Classified service does not do competency-based. They do experience-based. So they don't really care that you have the ability to do it. It's, have you done it, right? And so that's some of the distinction. The unclassified service is almost exactly the opposite. Unclassified service, you can do competency-based, comparable experiences or education or certifications. And so on the unclassified side, it's far it's far easier in terms of qualifying for jobs because we have a lot of latitude that the classified service does not, right? For unclassified jobs, you're going to actually look, the best advice is to look at the actual agencies themselves. So if you come here, the great thing, if you want to do higher ed, just notwithstanding UConn or UConn Health, if you go to the Board of Regents, so if you want to work at any of the community colleges or if you want to work at any of the 4 universities, they give you, they make it easy to give you links to all of, here's the current openings at the system office, and then you could just hit the links of each school. And so it makes it easier, so you don't have to hunt. UConn and UConn Health, you have to go to UConn and UConn Health separately. And so the easiest way for both of them is actually to scroll to the very bottom, and you will see they have at the bottom careers. You apply separate and distinct for the unclassified jobs through each of their own websites. Unlike the classified, where you apply through that one portal, unclassified, you apply directly at the agencies, right? Again, don't think that they call the same thing. We have 70 different bargaining units in the state of Connecticut, and so a professor at UConn is not the same thing as a professor here at CCSU, right? So even though it's very similar in what we call things, there could be slight variations, and so be careful with just assuming that. Keep in mind that the other branches of government, they are unclassified by virtue of their they're not a part of the executive branch. So here you're going to do 2 things for judicial. This link here is to judicial proper. So remember, in judicial, we have also the youth that used to be a part of DCF. That's now been transferred over to judicial. So if you want to work with youth in the criminal justice system, you're going to work with them through judicial more likely than you would at DCF. Right? They have continuous recruitments and they have specific recruitments. The continuous recruitments are like the juvenile detention officer, the marshals, right? The court recording. These things, when you apply to these, you apply to a pool, and as openings occur, you are considered. There's one other part of judicial that most people fail to appreciate, and they do not make a good sort of advertisement to it, and that's the public defender. So the Division of Public Defender, you would look on their site for any of the unclassifieds. This is an unclassified secretary as opposed to a classified secretary. And so you'll see that they use those confusing naming, right? This human resources assistant is an unclassified human resources assistant as opposed to a classified human resources assistant, right? Because, why is that? How do you know that? Because it's advertised here, not over on DAS. The legislature also is its own separate form of government. And so if you come down here, they have their own employment as well. And so you would look for their employment. So if you think about the state, we have our state agencies that are executive branch proper, the ones that you exactly know of. We have the legislature, we have the judicial branch. We have one other, and I want to be very, I want to point them out, and these are the quasis. The quasi-public agencies act as if they are their own entity. They do not fall directly under state service. Many of these positions, though, are granted state employee benefits. And so for the purposes of state employment, these are considered state employees. They don't fall into the unclassified or classified service in and of itself, right? Because they're run like private entities. It's that public, that quasi-public nature of it, right? So like the Connecticut Lottery Corporation, for example, they have their own board, they make up their own rules. It just happens to be that the majority of those employees are entitled to state employment benefits, right? They could be classified employees, right? But those jobs would be listed on the DAS website. But for the unclassified, you would want to go to their websites to apply for their unclassified jobs. Often you find, it doesn't look like they have careers. You often find in state service that this site gets blocked. IT will block this because they think you're gaming, right? We'll say it's an inappropriate use of state resources, but obviously employment search is not, right? But you'll see here they're currently purchasing or recruiting for lottery. I forewarn you about lottery though. If you are employed at lottery, you can't play the lottery. So if you like playing the lottery, be mindful that you may be restricted from that. Having said that, you apply just like you apply any job. You will often present an application. You will have perhaps some supplemental materials provided, asked for, whether it be a resume or a cover letter. The biggest mistake that people make with cover letters that I have found in state employment is they don't articulate what the qualifications are. They express their interest, which is great, but when you're reviewing so many applications, there's a sort of a commonality that kind of runs through. One thing that is very true, and I want to be very careful in distinguishing with you, there are sort of two types of employees. There's people that just process, right? And it doesn't matter what level you are. Processing is, there's already an established routine, you're just going in and you're just doing the work, right? As opposed to a person who is expected to think, to develop, to manage, right? These things aren't processing things. So like supervisors, you could supervise a process, but supervisors are expected to be able to think and adjust, be able to manage people, and so every day may be completely different. Whereas a processor, you may be a lawyer, you just come in and do your job, right? You file your, so don't get in the mindset that processors are only paraprofessionals. They're not, right? It could be at any level. If you are applying to a processing type job, we like to see people that have the experience. I've done the processing. So if you're applying for a lawyer position, right? it's not enough to say that you've met the requirements, you're licensed and so forth. Explain, I've done these transactional things, I've written wills, I've been into court and litigated, right? Give that what the process is, because we look at that because experience tells us much more, because then we can validate, we can verify, are you a great processor, are you good at your job, what's the range? If you're applying to a job that requires thinking and dynamics and that, then you express your ability to do that. It's not enough to process, right? We assume that you understand the processing part. Elaborate on, I have the ability to work with people and I understand that, right? One of the big things that supervisors, they make the mistake of, humans are humans. And when you supervise a human, you take everything that a human brings. And so every day, it doesn't matter whether they're a great employer or a bad employee, every employee is an employee and a human. So we all have good and bad days, and we all have strengths and weaknesses. And so a supervisor has to have the ability to be able to pivot and manage, right? And that's what we want to see. If you tell us that you're a great processor, you've told us nothing that you can have the ability to deal with people. Right? So these are the things that you want to articulate in those cover letters, especially if you don't know anyone. If you know someone's easier, because that person will parlay, they'll bridge that gap for you, but in that cover letter, be mindful of what you're applying for. Also be mindful of the environment with which you're applying. So for example, a person in DEP, so environmental protection, right, working in a state park, even if it's a secretary, as opposed to someone who is working at the Department of Transportation, the nomenclature, the environment, it's all completely different. And so if you have those skill sets, articulate that. Articulate that you understand what it is to work with engineers and work with because they have tons of federal monies and grants that pay for all these projects. That you're familiar with that environment, as opposed to DEP, where you're familiar with environmental state parks, where the nomenclature that really falls within the two, even though it's the exact same job, the secretary job. You see that here on campus. A secretary for the music department that understands musical instruments and understands tuning and arranging events for the band to travel and so forth is very different than a department of chemistry, where ordering supplies and understanding chemicals and how you handle them, right? The music, we don't really care if you understand about chemicals. It's great, but you're probably never going to do that in the music department. And so someone who has musical instrument knowledge or music experience is going to probably be better shaped for the job, right? So express that, right? Really give whoever is the hiring manager the ability to see, not only do you have the experience, not only are you within that sort of job realm, but you also are going to complement that particular area well. And I say this all the time, a lawyer can do anything, but you don't want to go to a lawyer for everything, right? If you have a criminal case, you want to go to a criminal lawyer, not a business lawyer. Even though our license allows us to do both, right? Because this business lawyer doesn't practice criminal law, they're just not going to have the expertise or the ability to easily navigate the case. Could they do it? Certainly they have the skills to do it. Do you want them to do it? Right. So I know it's a really quick overview of state employment, where to find it, where to find those key elements. And it really, it's about, there's nothing in the state that we don't employ. Every aspect of employment, we do some form of it. And so we mimic the private sector in every regard. Whatever you can do in the private sector, you can do in state service. It's just a matter of learning what we call it and sort of who actually employs those individuals. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Probably took way too much time.
Wow,
No.
Yeah.
What questions do you have?
Because I live basically down the street from Department of Labor, so my question is, how can you tell which department would be more classified to unclassified,
Yes.
job-wise?
So ask yourself, do they report directly to the governor? That the Labor Department does. And so everything at the labor department is classified. So you'll go to the DAS site
Okay.
for all of those jobs. And it's right here.
For me, like, I know that you said like a professor at UConn isn't the same thing as a professor at Central. Do you know some of the differences, or because I'm going into education and everyone's told me like at some point you should try, you know.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah, so when I say that there's a difference, they're actually the same union, but two different bargaining units within the same union. So they're both AAUP, but they're a different part of the union. So they're not the same. So AAUP here, their contract is different from AAUP UConn.
Yeah, Dan, I can probably answer that if you want. So, hi, thanks for doing this, and I'm really sorry I was late, but today's the day that the next gen proposals are due, and I had one to finish before I could leave home. Everybody, the training is the same and we all teach, but for UConn faculty, research is the #1 category of evaluation, and they are expected to do more research and publishing than we are here at CCSU. So they tend to teach, it's not only that they teach 2 classes a semester and we teach 4, but UConn has PhD programs, which we don't have. So we have master's degrees at CCSU. We have we have some doctorates of practice, but if you look at our graduate school programs, we have no PhD programs, and that's because UConn is by state statute the doctoral granting, the PhD granting institution of the state. And so that it doesn't so much change the training that a faculty member would have, but it changes the job responsibilities while they are at work. So they're much more research oriented and much more oriented toward training grad students, and particularly at the PhD level, than we are. Is that clear?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mahoney. It's great. It exemplifies sort of what I earlier was stating, that we're all very similar, but we're different at the same time. And so sometimes navigating this in terms of what your goals are and where you would like to see yourself. As Colin mentioned, I've been in 6 agencies, and I've purposely been in 6 agencies to develop my long-term plans. And in doing that, I encourage you to sort of have that same mentality, right? Knowing where you're going and how you're going to get there and what leads to the next step is something that is going to benefit you all throughout life. Because especially in state service, you'll find, and don't shy away from this, if part of your goal set is to make money in your priority list, right? There are ways you're going to approach that that's different. If making money is sort of that first connotation, then we look to see who are the highest paid within your next goal set, right? So the goal set might be, I need to make as much money as I want or can earn within the field of healthcare, right? So when you look at that, when you're now in the field of healthcare, nurses probably by and large make the largest amount of money early, right? And so if you can get into nursing, even if you want to be a doctor, right? If you want to get to doctor, that's great. But if you have to work before you get to doctor, nursing is going to be your biggest and fastest way to earn money, because it has so much flexibility regardless of the type of nursing that you do. And so you sort of approach it and you build it. right? And it's especially in state service. Developmental service workers are individuals that support individuals with intellectual disabilities or traumatic brain injuries, and so it's a caretaker type role. They are probably some of the highest paid individuals in the state, not because their job profession in and of itself is the highest paid, but because caretaking is a 24/7 operation, and so there's a tremendous need, and so there's a lot of work. And so if you're one of those types of persons that that's of interest to you, because it's 24/7 operation, because the availability of work is really high, it often gives people who have flexibility more earning potential earlier on than taking a standard office job, for example, that's limited to the 8 to 5, Monday through Friday type construct. And so that's the great thing about state employment, right? You can do anything. And so I always tell people, when you're doing your career development, think of where you are now and where you want to go and how you're going to build on that. And there's nothing wrong with sort of having these sort of stepped approaches. If making money is your important factor right now, because that gives you more resources to do other things, go to grad school, go and engage in other types of training or exposure to things, right? A developmental service worker, for example, could give you a lot of money early. And the skill set for that is, do you have those caretaking abilities, right? As opposed to trying to fit yourself into a secretary that, while it's a great profession, the construct of it is limited because it's an office job. It's limited to office hours. Their pay structure is, right, doesn't have a lot of work outside. It's not the 24/7 operation. I have a friend who is a developmental service worker. She's worked half the year and she's already earned over $50,000 in annual salary due to the amount of overtime she works. She's now putting herself through grad school, right? And she's only a part-time employee. So all that overtime, she works on a voluntary basis, right, for the most part. So now she has plenty of money for grad school.
So I have a question, because I know in private institutions, depending on which section or department of that, say, company you work in, your ability to transfer within the company and get certain positions becomes a lot easier. Is that the same for state jobs? Let's say you want to move between departments. How much easier or how much more difficult would it be for you to get either that same job in a different department or either something a little lower, a little higher in regards to you already being a state employee? Would you have a preferential treatment, or would you be more of a sideline just in case someone else with fresher credentials comes through the door?
So I'm going to answer in two ways. So most state employment is unionized. And in that unionized structure, there are unionized rules in which some bargaining units, they're not all the same, but they're very similar, right? For example, in 1199, which is our healthcare, transfers have preference over everyone else. You can't look at a new hire until you deal with transfers. And so transfers in the 1199 bargaining unit are giving preference. It would be a violation of the agency to hire a new hire over a transfer, right? In some cases where you don't have that strict construct, you still have where seniority might prevail. So maybe you have two equally situated candidates. The general unionized rule is that if the candidates are all but equal, then seniority prevails and who gets picked, right? So if you've been with the union longer or in that unionized position longer, then you may just be picked by virtue of that. And so it makes transferring and navigating much easier. You also have, and I don't want this to fall silent on you, you also have the reality that people that know how to do the process, our process, is always going to be preferred over those who don't, because it's a lack of training, right? If I have to train you to do state payroll versus someone who's already done state payroll, it's easier on me. And so,
they know how to put things in Core CT.
Exactly. Exactly. We just prefer people, not that because we don't want to train, it's when you're looking at resources and what you could do, you walk into the door already knowing how to do it. And so I have much more resource allocation available to me versus someone who doesn't. That's not always going to be true, right? But the majority of time, especially in state employment, you see, we prefer people that have actually pushed the buttons over people who just know. It's one thing that I know Excel versus I know how to run the reporting modules and the databases that the state uses, and I can model that data. Right? I don't have to show you how to use it.
Okay. Thank you.
What other questions? Don't get frustrated with it. Like I tell you, like it can be frustrating, but everybody wants into the state for a variety of reasons. Our benefits are really, really great. And security is arguably one of the more selling points of state employment. Could you get higher salaries in the private sector? Certainly you could. And I don't pretend that you couldn't. The offset to it, though, is, and this is where that public partnership that we have with our employees is that continuity of employment. This is why our unions have been very successful, and they've been very good to our state employees. They have protected their jobs, and so you do a good job, you come in, you do the work, right? The turnover, that flexibility that the private sector has isn't here, right? A state employee supervisor can't come in and say, I want fresh blood, like the private sector could. And so here you've got to follow the rules, and they've done a really great job of protecting that. Secondary, I know this probably doesn't mean a lot to you now, but our healthcare is second to none. And it may be hard for you to see today because you probably don't utilize a lot of healthcare, and why should you? You're young, you're healthy, right? But let me give you an example of why healthcare is, and I'm sure you studied this in your sociology classes, is a huge financial burden of which many state employees don't carry. So I had breast cancer, and in my breast cancer treatment, I went through a mastectomy, so a full surgery, and I went through a year's worth of chemo. I paid $100 was my burden for all of that. Our health insurance covered the rest. And so for me, as just a Connecticut citizen, I don't carry that financial burden of health, right? That's not true for some private sector employees, right? They may have good health care, but I would argue it's probably not as good as ours. And so, again, you may not need a lot of health care now, but the benefit, boy, if you do need it, or if your spouse or your children need it, boy, it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And you can thank the unions for that, because they have really, right, that's a negotiated statewide benefit that has benefited all of us. So it's a very good benefit.
My one last question would be, are those benefits like for all state jobs, or is it for like specific higher up positions, or is it union based?
Great question. So the state benefits are generally the same for everybody. There are some variations. Higher ed has different retirement plans than classified service has. And so in higher ed, you can choose amongst 4 classified service, and non-higher ed are limited to the state employees retirement system. Or if you're a teacher, you might you can participate in the teacher's retirement system. But higher ed has more options. Higher ed arguably has the better benefits of all the state employees, but they're generally the same.
Okay.
There are some jobs that don't qualify for benefits because you have to at least work half-time or greater. So for example, like university assistants don't, they work less than half-time, and so, and that's true for any job. If you work less than half-time, then you're not entitled to benefits. But if it's half-time or greater, generally, all state employees generally share the same benefits.
Okay.
Health insurance is universal, so that's universal. Retirement's a little different.
Thank you.
I would like to say on behalf of everybody here, thank you for coming. It's been a rather enlightening discussion.
Thank you very much.
Well, you're in great hands with Dr.
Yes.
Marlin.
And you all, thank you so much. And I'm in my other office, right? And I now have an online meeting with colleagues in Brazil starting in 1 minute. And yeah, the head of the system, everybody, Connecticut State Colleges and Universities is on campus today, which is, I'm assuming, why Anna Suski-Lashensky can't be here today. Yeah.
Yes.
So, and there's a time for students to see him. So if you're at all available. But
Great.
Dan, I just wanted to say, thank you so much. How to find a job in the state of Connecticut has always been to me a total mystery, right? And students ask, right? And I know that there were lots of administrative positions out there, right? And so, thank you. Yeah. And they're a great group of students, and we record this and it'll be on Teams so that, other people can check it out. Yeah. So thank you very, very much. Yeah. Nice to see you all. So I'm in Bassett, a prisoner in the history department again. Not really, but